Our next speakers we are having an armchair conversation on implications of national politics on state and regional clean energy and climate action. We have with us Pete Maysmith, the Executive Director of Conservation Colorado, the largest state-based environmental group in Colorado with over 25,000 members and 37 staff. And we are honored to have John Goldin-Dubois. He's the president of Western Resource Advocates and has been an innovator within the nonprofit community for almost 30 years. Let's welcome John and Pete. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks so much. It's great to be here, and Chip and everyone who puts this on so consistently and so terrifically. Thanks for having us. As she said, my name is Pete Maysmith. I'm the Executive Director of Conservation Colorado. We're a statewide environmental organization. We actually do both politics and policy and advocacy and organizing on climate change, public lands, and water, and we'll talk about some of our work here in just a little bit. I do want to mention that one of our fabulous board members who means so much to this community in so many ways is here, and I know you've already heard from him and will continue to, but John, it's great to see you, so glad you're here.
My name is John Goldin-Dubois. Wow, that's loud. And I'm the president of Western Resource Advocates, and we work across 7 interior western states to protect land, air, and water so that we have vibrant communities that are in balance with nature. I guess I want to add one other thing. Last night, Pete and I were at dinner with a friend, and we had this conversation about everything that's happening in the Trump administration and what's happening on climate-related issues. And he said to us, he said, how do you guys keep hope in this current environment? So our hope here is to talk a little bit about that, talk about what's happening on the federal level, but then also to talk about why we both have hope. So you already know about climate change. Most of us who live here in the West have seen many of the implications already. We've seen flooding in Colorado and across the region as recently as the last few years ago. We've seen wildfire, Utah. This example is in Utah, but each of the states across the West has experienced similar kinds of things. Drought, this is Lake Mead in 2015. I think that water level has actually dropped a little bit. It's about 120 feet below full. Lowest level since the reservoir was filled many, many, many years ago. These are just some of the things that we're seeing from climate change. And of course, you've seen this picture before as well from Paris when the agreement was first reached. What we know is that scientists say we have to limit warming in the climate between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius in order to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. What that means is that we have to see a 40 to 60% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors by 2030 and an 80 to 90% reduction, or better yet, 100% reduction by 2050 in order to avoid those worst implications of climate change. We're not there yet. Obviously, there's been some backsliding.
So this next slide talks about what's been going on at the federal level, and there has been, as I'm sure many of you know, or all of you know, some really significant progress over the last many number of years, but we're at a place where we're clearly moving backwards, and that's not acceptable for the reasons John just outlined in terms of what we need to do to keep this planet inhabitable for future generations. But just a quick rundown, lots of efforts around cap and trade. The most recent one was 2009, passed the House and the United States House and didn't get a vote in the U.S. Senate. Some really exciting progress that again has now been stalled thanks to both who's in the White House and what the congressional makeup looks like in the House and the Senate. So the Clean Power Plan done in 2014, which is now on pause at least. That's the most optimistic way of looking at it. Obviously, the high-profile withdrawal from Paris just a couple weeks ago. Things like methane capture, which we pioneered here in Colorado, I'll talk about that in just a minute, won a critical vote on the floor of the U.S. Senate, which was really exciting. We beat big oil on the floor of the U.S. Senate a couple weeks ago. That's worth cheering about, right? 3 Republicans voted with all the 48 Democratic United States senators and beat big oil. The problem is that through agency action at both the BLM and the EPA level, there's again attempts to slow down methane capture, which, as everyone knows, is a very potent greenhouse gas. Budget cuts and more at EPA, and then now there's talk and concern even about backwards movement on CAFE standards or fuel efficiency standards. So we all know what we need to do for decarbonization. There's a pathway, several pathways there, and that's what this slide talks about. One is we have to increase our energy efficiency across all sectors and all fuels and all manner of work that we do. Two is decarbonize as absolutely as fast as possible the electricity sector. That's where a significant amount of work has gone into, and John will talk about that in just a second, both here in Colorado and in the interior West and the coastal West for that matter, and that's been exciting progress. We need to do fuel switching away from fossil fuels and plug in everything in the transportation sector and the building sectors, and then of course have it be powered by a clean grid, obviously, which gets back up to the point number 2, which is decarbonizing the electricity sector. And so that's the third one. And then also decarbonize away from other fossil fuels. So if you think of jet airplanes and other ways that we use fossil fuels, we have to move off of those. There's some exciting stories about what we've done here in Colorado that we'll get to in just a second, but those are the pathways that we need to be on, and John will talk about some of the work in the West.
Yeah, first I want to talk a little bit about the electricity sector because Pete mentioned the number of pieces of legislation or actions at the federal level that have stalled out or where we've backslid over the past several months in particular. But I wanted to add one thing that has happened that's been very positive in terms of how we address climate change. And although it's not specifically a set of climate bills, the production tax credits and the investment tax credits for solar energy and for wind energy have been critical in a variety of different ways. They've been critical in terms of driving down the price of renewables, and in particular wind and solar. They've been critical in beginning to integrate wind and solar into electricity systems across the country, particularly when you look here in the West where we have great both wind and solar resources. That's been particularly effective. The reality is that the vast majority of resources that have been invested in addressing climate change have gone to the federal level. So that's philanthropic, it is government, it is all the resources that we've seen have mostly gone into federal level efforts. But it's time we might think a little bit differently about that, because even with vastly fewer resources, there's been a lot of progress on climate-related issues, and in particular addressing carbon emissions in the western U.S. We wanted to take just a snapshot of the interior West to talk a little bit about some of what's happened in terms of that work. You can see here, if you look at this set of power plants or representations of power plants, you can see that all the white ones have already been retired. So they've already been committed to be closed or are already closed. The gray ones are in process right now. Those will be closed by 2026. And then the black is what's going to remain on the system post-2026. What this totals is a 25% reduction in total carbon emissions across all sectors in this interior western area, and a 40% reduction by 2026 in the electricity sector. So there have been real gains across the region in this respect, in part due to direct efforts to close coal-fired power plants, in part because there are now these replacement resources, wind and solar, which have been particularly growing in the western region. But you can also see, if we've retired 11 gigawatts by 2026, that there's still a pretty big chunk that we have to take on, 19 gigawatts, over the course of the next several years to close down these plants by 2030, and then again to look at the last remaining set of them by 2050. There you go.
Oh, okay, great. So I'm just going to go ahead and put some of these up right now. Hopefully I don't go too far. Okay, so John just said something really important, and I want to pick up on that. And that is that the vast amount of climate work, when I say work, I mean advocacy, political dollars and energy, policy, organizing, you name it, has been directed at the federal level for the vast for the significant number of last years. And I talked about some of the results, which have been good and exciting, but now we're seeing that backward slide. And so this moment demands and calls for an opportunity and a necessity to focus on state and regional level activity. And at the end of the panel before us, the conversation, there was a quick summation about optimism and pessimism, if you will, right, up there, and Jerry and Harris, and right. I fall on the mostly, not totally, optimistic end of the spectrum. And the reason I do that is because when we put time and energy and resources, and that's human capital, and that's, again, organizing and policy and advocacy and politics as well, and dollars, when we put that into the state level and the regional level, we see real results. And the best place to talk about that is one of the best places, but since we're in Colorado, and I'm with Conservation Colorado, I'll talk a little bit about Colorado. So what we can do at the state level is we can cut carbon emissions by closing those coal-fired power plants. John just talked about that in the last slide, what's already happened in the interior West and what still needs to happen in the interior West. We can do things that promote that investment in renewable energy. Again, John talked about the federal tax credits, which are essential, but state-level renewable energy standards, like what we have here in Colorado, which varies from 30% down to 10%, depending on what the type of utility is, an investor-owned utility, a rural electric utility, that's 20%, or a municipal utility is down to 10%. But anyway, the point is we need to have, and those all obviously need to go up. Those are good numbers, but they're not enough, right? So we need to do more on the renewable energy side, because that spurs more investment and more activity that we've seen. Increase energy efficiency. As recently as just a couple weeks ago, I think it was 10 days ago, we were with the Governor Hickenlooper here in Colorado to sign the reauthorization and the extension of the energy efficiency resource standard, which incentivizes the dominant utility, the investor-owned utility here in Colorado, Xcel Energy, to continue to do more energy efficiency, basically to sell less of their product. It incentivizes them to do that, and there's other ways that we can work on energy efficiency. Capture methane, I talked about that. What I didn't say, and what I bet some folks know, but maybe not everyone knows, is that here in Colorado, we pioneered that a couple years ago. First state in the nation to require capturing methane from oil and gas, drilling and facilities, pipelines, tanks, storage, et cetera. That then became the model for what EPA and BLM have been doing, and other states, I might add, since then. So that's another opportunity here at the state level. And then a transition to electric vehicles. Again, we have to decarbonize the transportation sector. That is something that we've begun to make progress. We've got great tax credits. Here in Colorado, the Washington Post said Colorado is the best state in the nation to buy an electric vehicle. That was just about a year ago that they said that. We're not quite yet the best state in the nation to drive an electric vehicle, because we have to do a lot more with the charging infrastructure. We tried to do that this legislative session, and we're unfortunately unsuccessful, and we'll talk more about that. And I should say that I think the clock got set to 15 minutes, unless I'm wrong, and I think we're up here for a half hour, although maybe we're only up here for 15. So just a quick logistical note, but we'll keep going, and when we get booted off, we'll stop. So I think that's the end of the slide. So let me just add another minute or two on Colorado, and then John will talk about some of the regional efforts, because that's what WRA, I mean, we work hand in glove, Conservation Colorado, with WRA here in Colorado. They, of course, do a lot more regional work that we don't do, and so it'll be interesting to hear from him, and thank you for the clock adjustment. So a couple things I want to say. First off, everyone here knows Gail Schwartz. She's in the audience. She's right over there. Hi, Gail. And I just, yeah, that's right. I just want to say the progress that we have seen in Colorado is thanks to a whole lot of people. Many others who are here in this audience as well. But as someone in the state Senate who authored a lot of these bills, championed a lot of the bills, whether it's around, again, renewable energy, energy efficiency, solar, you name it, a whole set of things. It was Gail and, of course, many of her colleagues that really drove that forward. And here's what I want to say about that. Remember I said that I'm on the optimistic side of the spectrum? It's because we know that Coloradans and the voters are with us. Right before I came here, I did a press call. We were releasing our scorecard for how all the legislators did on the key environmental issues of the day this last legislative session, which just concluded approximately a month ago. So I was talking to reporters about that. And a fact I shared is that 76% of Coloradans are more likely to support a candidate for public office who wants to invest and do work in wind and solar energy versus a candidate who does not. So and there's reams of other data, but I'll just leave it at that for the moment when it comes to polling data. So we know that the voters are with us. That's not unique to Colorado. That's the case in the states where WRA works, in the Intermountain West, right? So if we can take this moment, this opportunity to drive further forward, faster at the state level and at the regional level. Look, we can't do everything that we need to do at the federal level. I know that, and I'm not naive, and that's why I said I'm mostly optimistic. I'm not 100% optimistic. But what we can do is show the path forward that 1, cuts carbon emissions, 2, grows renewable energy, and 3, charts a path both for other states and eventually, and hopefully that eventually is a short eventually, not a long eventually, we can get back to doing federal level climate policy. So I've got a few more things to say on that, but why don't I stop and John can talk some about the regional work that WRA does.
Yeah, I'd just add a handful of different things that are happening around the interior West that kind of are on similar path with Colorado that shows that we can really reduce carbon emissions and replace that with clean energy resources. So in New Mexico, the San Juan generating station, 2 units were agreed to be closed by the end of this year. They were agreed in 2015, so those will close very shortly. As part of that agreement, we and our partners worked with the Utility Commission in New Mexico to ensure that there was a conversation about retiring the remaining units by 2019. That conversation is at a head right now here in 2017, that we expect that all 4 of those units will be closed within the next few years. The Navajo generating station looks like it is headed to very quick closure, maybe as early as 2019. That's the largest coal-fired station across the western U.S. that's remaining. The last coal plant in Nevada, the Valmy plant, was just an agreement to close that down. So you can see that this trend is continuing, and there's a lot of progress that's being made in these states. Sometimes that is happening in a more political environment like a state legislature, but often a lot of these decisions are happening in front of public utility commissions because the commissions are understanding that consumers are going to win, they're going to get cheaper energy that's clean energy across the region. Large wind farms that are large wind generating stations are being created across the western U.S. As you know, here in Colorado, 600 megawatts were approved just last year, largest wind farm in Colorado on the Excel system. They now are the largest wind producer in the United States. There's an even larger proposal to do a very large wind farm that would benefit New Mexico and Texas. That's before the Public Utility Commission there now. So this set of progress that we're seeing across the region is really expanding. Now, there's still a ton of work to do, and public utility commissions are not the only place to make these decisions. I think the reality is that in this day and age, the elected leadership is not necessarily doing that great of a job of representing where the voters are. Some of the polling that we've seen across the region shows that 78% of Westerners here in the interior West want more solar and they want more wind. There's not really aggressive action happening among political leadership in Western states. So much of that slack is left up to utility commissions that are understanding the costs continue to drop. These are really great investments, and we're seeing more and more of that. But continues to be a challenge around the West, but there also is real progress. Of that 19 gigawatts, can we get 3 or 4 more gigawatts agreed, 5 gigawatts agreed to close by the end of 2026 and closed by 2030? I think that's possible, and then we have some big steps to go from there still.
And just the point that John made, and then we want to open it up and see if you all have questions and comments and thoughts for us. But I want to pick up on, because Conservation Colorado, we live at the intersection of politics and policy, and we very much believe that, who's in the governor's mansion or who's, in a state legislature and chairing a committee or the Speaker of the House or President of the Senate, et cetera, matters, right? I mean, that influences what those outcomes, what bills get introduced, what bills make it through committee, what bills get passed and signed into law, et cetera, and in many, many other ways. I just want to leave you with something that, again, it speaks to my optimistic side, right? So John Hickenlooper is term limited as the governor of Colorado. So he'll be in office for about another year and a half. So it is a wide open race on the Republican side and on the Democratic side to replace him. And of the 5 Democratic announced candidates, that's 5. It's a crowded field. Does anyone want to make an announcement right now? All right, great. 6. It seems like we're up to 6. That's great. Welcome. Is that 2 of, I would consider, you know, there's some great candidates there. 2 of some of the top tier candidates just last week announced independently of each other, you talk about a mashup that I just love, that they are calling for 100% renewable energy in Colorado, of course, by the year 2040. That is bold, that is aggressive, and that is exactly what we need. Another candidate, again, I think one of the top tier candidates, is calling for a 50% renewable energy standard in Colorado by 2030. Again, we're basically at 30%, or, you know, it moves around a little bit, but, you know, think of it as 30%, calling to bring that up to 50%. That's bold, that's important, and that's impressive. And that's because that's where the citizens are, right? They conduct polls. They don't do that just because they got out of bed one morning and think it sounds neat. They do that because they know that's where the voters are, and that's where our power lies, and that's where our opportunity lies in this time of darkness in Washington. There is optimism in Colorado and in the western United States writ large. We'll stop, and do you have...
Well, just one final
Yes.
thought before we take questions. I do think it requires a true reorientation
Yes.
of investment in resources in state-level efforts.
Yes.
There has always been some of that over the course of the past 15, 20 years as there's movement towards renewable energy has happened. But the vast majority of resources continues to go to federal efforts. There's a lot of bad stuff that we should stop. Absolutely. There are things that we need to be engaged in, we need to stop. But investments in state-level reforms, as we showed you, have really paid off. And if we can redirect resources in a true way that allows us to make progress in those states, it's going to be tremendous. And it really is, good, to use a Trump word, it's going to be tremendous. And it really is going to lead to this revolution in clean energy. So we'll stop there and take questions.
What questions or comments do you guys have for us?
There's one in the back there.
Thank you. What is your position on energy choice in Nevada? And you may know that the governor of Nevada vetoed the increase in the RPS. So where do you think we need to focus now?
So Governor Sandoval did sign several renewable energy bills in Nevada, including a fix to the net metering problem, so people will be adequately rewarded for having solar panels on their roof. He did veto the renewable energy standard, which would have bumped it from 25 to 40%. Our team was very engaged and worked to write the bill there, so we're very disappointed that the governor vetoed it. I think there is going to have to be much more work in Nevada to ensure that we can continue to advance. I don't know whether it's fortunate or not, the reality is Nevada is largely powered today by gas. So we do need to spur a quick transition from gas-based resources to renewable energy. It's clearly not going to happen in this year. We're going to have to continue to work on it. I do think as the price of renewable energy continues to drop, the case just becomes more and more compelling, and Western governors, Western leaders just aren't going to be able to avoid it.
Super quick comment on that. I know there's other, just really quickly, the reason that 11 renewable energy bills and climate bills passed is because there was a change in leadership in the legislative chambers in Nevada. 9 of those 11 got signed, obviously not all of them. But again, it just comes back to where the voters are and wanting to see elected leadership that supports this, and I think that's so important. I know there's other questions. I think there's one
Thank you
over
so
there.
much for your guys' work and for this conversation, this great conversation, and I'm so happy that you're optimistic. My question actually has to do with the frack gas infrastructure that is currently being built out in this country, and what your thoughts are about like how that can be shifted. Right now in upstate New York, we have the CPV power plant, which has not been talked about that much in the media, And a lot of the big greens have actually been talking about, that this is actually, they don't want to talk about it. So what do you think about things like that? The CPP power plant will actually generate 20 billion tons of greenhouse gases. So how can we be optimistic? I mean, I want to be optimistic too, and I am in some ways, because I feel like we're grassroots level also has to be, listened to. But what can we do about this issue? It's very serious.
I'll start with that one. When we passed a bill here in Colorado 7 years ago to shut down about 900 megawatts of coal-fired power, back to that slide that John had, a number of those Colorado plants that have come offline now were because of that. And some of that, certainly, or a good amount of that, frankly, back then was envisioned as transitioning to natural gas, right? And that's, not okay, but that, just where that was. Here's, though, the reality that's happened is that as it turns out, far more of that power got transitioned either through energy efficiency, so just not built out, which is obviously the best answer of all, but then, of course, there was replacement capacity, obviously. 900 megawatts is a lot of power. And that way more of that was built out as wind, mostly, a little bit of solar, but mostly wind in Colorado. So my answer is we can't be building out natural gas infrastructure in some, like big capacity that's going to be with us for, decades to come. And the need to do it is decreasing dramatically because of the ITC, the PTC, and just technology. The cost curve is just falling, plummeting like a rock on both wind and solar. Ben Folk, who runs Xcel Energy, the CEO, has said, wind is on sale. It's the cheapest resource I can put on the system, right? Cheaper than gas, cheaper than anything. We need to keep bending that cost curve down and making sure replacement resources are renewable.
I'd just add one thing, and that is, 6, 8, 10 years ago, environmentalists, conservationists were all talking about natural gas as the bridge to the future that would provide a bridge to renewable energy. You don't hear that anymore. And you don't hear that because renewable energy is here, it is deployable, it is cost effective, and increasingly all decisions are going to go that way. I think your point, though, is really well taken. With new gas investments and new infrastructure, you build plants that are going to have a 30-year lifespan, and that does bake in that use. So I do think it is incumbent upon us to advance solutions that really do focus on all renewables.
There's a couple questions up front.
I think they're passing around.
Oh, whoops,
Yeah.
never mind. Sorry.
Hi, Rod Richardson with the Grace Richardson Fund. We've been doing a series of policy design charrettes to look at the idea of reducing the cost of capital for clean solution investment. Mostly we've been looking at federal level, but there have been some interesting state level ideas that have come up. The green bond market is exploding. One of the things you might consider doing in states like Colorado or New Mexico or Texas that have significant income tax rates, between high 4% to over 6% in Texas, is you could have tax exemption for green bonds. Right, that are, and especially that do projects in the state that drive jobs to the state. That would allow, tax cuts are very popular with everybody, and especially with Republicans and conservatives. So you could get them into the game more that way, and you could also, really boost the financing. So that's one idea. Another idea is, a lot of the oil and gas stuff. Leases off of, they have leases off of state lands, right, in a lot of these states. So you could do things where you reduce the royalty rates if they do things that reduce emissions, like putting solar power on the wellheads to drive that, or using new VPO collection units and things like that. Or even, being willing to do R&D testing on new equipment that can radically reduce emissions. So what do you think of, looking at ideas like that go towards reducing cost of capital for clean solutions?
I think it's a great idea. I think in Colorado, it is an incredibly complex conversation vis-a-vis our budget limitation measure. So and we've talked to friends and allies about that. It's very much on our list of things we want to look at. I think in the interest of getting some other, yes, I like it. Complicated, long answer. If we really had another couple hours on the Colorado budget, but let's move to another question
And it might be more practical in other states around the region than Colorado, that specific idea.
because of the budget stuff here, the limitations. I think there's a question there, and I know there's others.
Yes, the long-term issue with having all that natural gas put in is a real issue, but I do propose, and Alan sort of said it yesterday, there is a solution to that. If you can get your CO2, and I'll talk about this later, back from the air, you can make methane from the hydrogen you can make with the excess wind or the excess sunshine you have. One of the features of renewable energy is it's on and off whenever it likes, not when you like it. So overbuild and take the excess into the storage of natural gas, which you can then run through those gas turbines, which by then are at the end of their life. Additionally, you can make fuel for cars or trucks and airplanes.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. I think, natural gas development in Colorado and across the region, Four Corners area, is pretty controversial. People don't want drilling near their homes. They don't want it near their water sources. They don't want it in their backyard. And that's pretty understandable. And I think people are becoming increasingly sensitive to that. Where it is happening, though, we have to be really clear that high rates of slippage, so leaking, venting, flaring, is just not acceptable anymore. We know the impact that methane is going to have on the climate equation, and we have to demand from companies that are producing this stuff that's baked in, there can't be leakage. We got to have systems that have less than 1% leakage, and there's very few that are committed to it. Very few oil and gas developers are committed to it, and those that are committed to it aren't there yet. But those are demands that we have to make.
They put 15 minutes more on, but we have now come to the conclusion of that, so we're going to call it here. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions. Thanks. It was great to have a conversation with you all.